More than ever, teaching piano, in my case, I consider to be a holistic approach to prepare beyond the industry of playing the technique in order to extract the sounds, organize the sounds, have independence of fingers, gymnastics, so to say, the grammar, so to say, of the things that through which the vehicle is more important because it reaches a destination which is most of the time in the past. The dead masters whom are alive when we read them on the music score, and we have to intelligently understand the intended hints about lyrics about that are not because it's without lyrics, but from the choral works, from the sacred music, from the chamber music, from the orchestral orchestrations, specifically therefore instrumentations, and how all these elements contribute to the rhetoric, to the expression of the hinted meanings, which are part of a larger picture. And that is my point, is civilization. So yes, it's a time machine through technique. But if you assume that the student will understand the culture of the way people thought about life, how philosophers imagined the meaning of life, how the belief systems organized this, because most of the musicians were serving either church, either princes or kings, and therefore the music which we play on the piano, it can be decontextualized, and you just play it for what it is: fun, laugh, sad, hope, dreamy. Of course, that is very, very unspecific in terms of stylistic frame. And I think that some of my students know that I always insist a lot about the stylistic frame and what you exclude and what you include within the frame of a style of an early classical with Haydn, Beethoven opening the door to Romanticism. At least that's how we tend to organize the chronology of events in the evolution of the stylistic expression, and then the Romanticism, and then the modernity, and all these things happened for a purpose. It was aesthetic, but it was intellectual, but it was also therefore political in the sense of organizational of society, and the wars and the perception of the empires for the individual musical, in the case of music is a language, ritualistic for burying, birth, marriage, accompanying the life of people, especially in the church, which gave them the structure of their life, also the organization of the rulers over the people who were ruled, and therefore the alphabetization or kept analphabetization of the people in order for them to do the manual jobs for the powerful people who owned the lands and who ruled the place and who organized through the wars the territorial disputes. And all this is learned in history, and it could appear unrelated to the artworks during that history, but between the Renaissance and the different evolution of the technologies and the sciences and or ignorances, and that became then enlightenments. For instance, the Haydn early classical sonata form is just not Haydn coming up with a form. It's really about instrumental and no more choral or danced imitation on the keyboard when he writes a sonata. And it could be a form that goes for a symphony, a piano trio, or a choral piece. But the form was very important because it was a organization of the thought, not only, but of the nature within the frame of a style. And of course, since we play today music and study music and perform music from different time periods, even if on the modern piano they appear to be, for the purists and specialists in the individual time niches, betrayal. I would say that the universalism of the keyboard within the time frame understanding of the specificities of the style allow for pianists to play informed, cultivated, cultured sound productions of phrasings and sounds. Of course, we don't have bowings and breathing and styles of singing, the vibrato, less vibrato, more vibrato. These are all like the instrumental music of the past, from harpsichord to fortepiano for the keyboards, for instance, transmitting the music beyond even the instruments in their imagination. If it's a textured string quartet aria on the piano, or a fugue, pure music, voices that are equal and that have no accompaniment and that are beautifully, harmoniously, meaningfully playing with each other in terms that they're organized together, a harmony of the senses, of the expression, and of the mind, of the spirit. It's a reflective music, profoundly so, especially when it's without lyrics. So of course you can put lyrics to it, and they do in requiems, in motets, in oratorios, and then they display and describe the story of the Christian Bible, obviously, for Bach, who was a church musician, to Fauré, who was also a church musician. So for centuries this was the case, and I want to think that when we teach piano playing, of course we need to teach, and I attach in great importance to the piano technique. I design exercises for independence of fingers, independence of rhythm, to be able to play 2 against 3, rhythmically understanding or strengthening the fingers in their individual articulation and display or projection. And then writing down the polyphony, if it was to be played on the piano, in the 4 or 5 parts, as many as they are, displayed on the score rather than bunched on the 2 staffs. Piano writing, which verticalizes the hearing by the playing. So you cannot separate the one from the other, or then you fake it. And in order to take the time to absorb it and then translate into your fingers what you heard of the layered music, which was really the church music of the Renaissance to our days, of the Christian church, of the Catholic Church. And that's different tradition with different countries and different geographies and different time periods, the antique Greek and the modes and all these things. Of course, universities and universalism towards the universal knowledge, and inevitably it can be superficial if you try to inevitably cover all the time periods, and then it becomes a little bit of a 5-day European trip. If it's Wednesday, it's Brussels. No, in fact, we try to stay a little bit more in depth, at least I do, by taking extra time for each individual lesson to not only teach how to play it better in terms of the production of the fingers, reliable as well for the students to have a comfortable technique. So I give them the know-how and teach them the patterns, how to develop it on their own once they realize that there are patterns that are reproduced and you have to think and to develop it. So I don't try to spoon feed them. It's the sayings goes. But I like to think that it's important to contextualize, because ultimately you play Haydn is Austrian Empire that irrigates all the east of Europe with a Western European tradition of music all the way to the Ottoman Empire area. And this for centuries of tonal music between Bach and Ravel, let's say, until the end of World War I, when the Austrian Empire disappeared. And so to organize that tonal system, that style we call classical or early first Viennese school, and Haydn organizing the form, it's not just notes and scores, and we just recite the right notes, and of course the wrong notes are not right. That is so simple. You have the guessing, you have the hinting, you have the humor, you have the spirited movements, where Haydn introduces an element also of humor, or how to hint a second theme before the second theme. Why do you have 2 themes? How you develop the material? This is fascinating. And I think besides reciting the score, the pianist should be informed to rethink, understand the purpose of it and the technique of it, the writing technique and the playing technique, which was not separated in the past, since all performers and composers were all in one. Today they're separated, so I teach them to be informed interpreters even if they don't compose anymore. Informed means understand the values of the tradition in which this music was written. Understand by listening, first of all, to the music, and I invite them to listen to a Haydn symphony, Haydn quartet, a Haydn mass, when they practice a Haydn sonata, not only the piano work. I ask them to think about paintings, and I give them ideas who to watch, what sculpture was done, what thinkers. And of course, you have to have time to develop the knowledge of the philosophy of Age of Enlightenment, for instance. Of course, I don't teach philosophy, I don't teach history, and I contextualize the piece within the music of its time for the expression of it. Of course, these composers wrote music for their own time, for their own survival, because it was, but also with a certain idea that their artwork was creating a certain harmony and organization of the sounds that corresponded to their vertical organization of their societies, or their desire of horizontal layering of the societies that created then the bourgeoisie and then the middle class and so on. It wasn't just a vertical from the rich owner to the slaves, but in between you have all these layers. And Haydn, for instance, I insist on him because Ravel mentioned that he admired the most Haydn because he expressed all the musical content within a form. And this form defines, like a frame, what you're going to put into in as essence compared to the form. And the form is there not to limit you, but in fact to give you the opportunity to focus even more clearly on what you want to present in the contrasting two themes that you will develop. And in a recap tonalization, it would be like a male-female development is the combination, and then comes out the child or the children in the tonalization. So this idea philosophically of assimilating opposites, completing them. Haydn didn't invent it, he just crystallized this at the Age of Enlightenment, which was no more fear of God, not God, but the church, which was the organization that ruled the thoughts and the freedoms or lack of the people at all levels in the 18th century in Europe, for instance. And who are the philosophers in Europe who are thinking about the Age of Enlightenment that we call so? It's also an age of humanism. It's an age where they started thinking that the humans should believe in themselves, that they are part of the creation. They're not it and all of it, but they are not either just elements that are predestined to just serve on earth the rich master and then expect an afterlife, which was an organization that stifled a lot of the individual creative freedoms of those who dared have any, in theater writings, in plays, in philosophic essays, and of course totalitarian rules didn't want and never did and never would do ask for unlike dissent or informed citizens and alphabetized people who can read. That's what happened with Gutenberg when he built up the first press, and therefore the Bible went from Latin, which was a dead tongue even already there, then to become around the time of the discovery of America by Christopher Columbus, at least when it was attributed to that, in 1492, that the common people could get access to the holy writing and read it in their own language, in this case German, which ended up bringing reform to the Catholic Church and created the Protestant Church. And then this kind of liberating of the spirits and giving the people the awareness of their culture by in fact giving them education and access by their own self to reflect upon the writings, and not only the priest telling them what they say. And therefore this is the age of today, with the of the decades past, where we have this technology that allows everybody to be a contributor, not always positively, to say the least, on the social medias, but nevertheless it is a way to bring the conversation on the center of the global village digitally. And that globalization of today should not erase the individual characteristics of the different cultures and histories and beliefs. And of course, there's an evolution through time between science and medicine and expectation of life, and then all kinds of things that come from this to organize differently the thinking of the world, let less the art within the world, its purpose. Does it reflect the world, or does it project an idealized better world? Is it music for the afterworld, or is it music to express through an universal language the essence of our psychological being, of anxiety, hope, despair, longing, and hope, ultimately? And I think that when the Bach piece ends in major, it's not just in major, it's also for sound reasons, because the sound in minor has harmonics which combine and are dissonant in the so-called harmonics resonance style order. When you finish in major, the triad is so clean that you don't have any beatings of resonances. But in fact, in the Romantic era, that was replaced with the symbolism of hope and joy in major, whenever despair and sadness in minor. Be it very simplistic, it's more subtle than that, because you have different types of minors, ascending, descending, harmonic, melodic, and all. But still, it is a way humans care and carry ahead the different ways of expressing themselves. The anguish of birth, not to die at birth, the anguish to die and what is after, the desire to accomplish yourself, if you can, during the time you're alive, and what do you consider accomplishment for the society, for the village, for the group, for the country, for the empire, for what? And so, of course, these kind of situations were not easy to today oversee, but I believe that if you contextualize the idea of the form in music is no more only dances like the suite of dances of the Baroque partitas, or arias in where the piano or the keyboard at the time played the melodic line in one hand and the accompaniment in the other, the fugue, the equal voices, the polyphonic layering, the equal voices society of behaving harmoniously, the word harmony, contrapoint, of course, point against point, polyphony in Greek, polyphonos, many voices, and how to follow them and how to bring them out and how to display them, sing them, play them, conduct them, organize them with one brain, all of them, or have different brains singing individual parts. It's the group united together in a chord, the dominant, the tonic, the subdominant. And when you realize that all this comes to an organization, by essence, you have to choose what you keep and what you exclude from putting in the form. And so the idea of the chaos of nature, the rainforest or the deserts, is without human direct involvement. And when humans come, they irrigate, they organize, or they take away trees to build more buildings, to organize their society, where they trade with the money. That are the values that they added with their language and their. In other words, all this societal organization is part of the expression of a organized mankind over nature. And that was the ideal in part of Haydn's time, where he organized a form where the elements have to behave in a certain way. There is room for creativity, there is room for organization that is because of the, let's say, construction, architecture of the plan, and especially imitations and the idea of architectural symmetry was very important, because it gave the impression to us, all humans, that the human mind can create something where nature was just in a chaos of its beauty as well as its chaos. And so that humankind comes to organize the chaos of nature, regardless of the fact that today the philosophy doesn't agree with that, and I agree also to disagree with it. But you have to contextualize, to organize, to explain how this came to be and how their minds were set, because you cannot think that Haydn or Beethoven or Chopin or Mozart or Liszt or Schubert or Ravel or Debussy or Fauré or Bach and Handel and Scarlatti, from Baroque to Classic to Romantic to Modern, and then Stravinsky and Ligeti and all these, they all were people of their time. even if they thought either in their past by reviving the traditions, neoclassical, Baroque, or neo-Baroque, or then trying to rethink the order of the notes entirely from the ground up, like Schoenberg did in the beginning of the 20th century with the serial dodecaphonism, which means in Greek 12, for the 12 tones of the chromatic scale. So yes, in his case, mankind rearranges the order of the notes instead of the natural resonances of the notes from the overtones and the harmonics. Therefore, one can appear to be a little bit out of subject when you teach a piano sonata by Haydn to explain where is the Austrian Empire, what is geographically its place, its shining expression of the Catholic Church that was the Austrian Empire's ruling church over all the different principalities or regions, as you like to call it, like Hungary, Romania, of course, mostly Czech Republic, and then, of course, Serbia, and then Croatia, and all these. And how this was, in fact, the outpost of the Western music into the east of Europe, and how the idea of this civilization brought people to either liberate themselves creatively as artists, which most of them were craftsmen and most of the time literally slaves of their owners in music. So it wasn't like they had, unfortunately for Haydn too, a music library like our school has here, which is incredible because you can really dig into so many directions, and of course one can drown oneself in too much knowledge because of the capacity, availability, and ways to learn all the niches and then all the general frameworks and then all the repertoire. Of course it's impossible. Most people would say that is not even necessary. So it's better to choose what you understand better, what you feel better. Is it according to the intuition of your musicianship? And you say, I rather develop knowledge and concentrate on research on specific composers of a given period, let's say the Romantic era or something. Oh yeah, of course, that I think is necessary, but when you're at the level where you study the main repertoire pieces and you study a Haydn sonata, a Beethoven sonata, a Chopin sonata, a Schubert sonata, it's a Schumann sonata, and then you advance into the Brahms sonata, and then you get into the Prokofiev, Rachmaninoff sonatas and Bartok and so on. They're all called sonatas for the form, from the Italian word sonare, resonating or voices sounding. But it's a purely instrumental form that can become a symphony in Beethoven, or it can be a piano trio in Schubert, or it can be a piano quintet in Brahms. But the idea of the two opposite themes, development, recapitulation, and then creating an osmosis from the differences. And then having a rondo form from the last movement, which is more from the dances of the past. But you have an ABACAD, like all the pop songs of the day, with the ritornello and the couplets. Of course, a middle movement that would be reflective and slow, of an ABA form with a symmetry of the A and A prime, and then the B, the other section that is contrasting in its own way. So these guidelines, already Beethoven, after applying them briefly, as Beethoven was an early student of Haydn, but also an early rejecting the Haydn order of organizing these, while Chopin, way after that, wrote his sonatas in 4 movements in the pure tradition of the formal tradition of Haydn. So Liszt wrote a 1-movement sonata, Beethoven 2-movement sonatas at the end of his life. So they all rethought the form until they broke it in order to express what is the essence of it out of it. So in order to give the context of the understanding of the meaning, of the purpose, not that we can define always the purpose of why they wrote the piece that I teach them, but I want them to have a wider perspective of understanding the culture, the language, the literature, literally, the theater plays, the essays, the philosophic essays, doesn't need to be all read, all learned in depth in order to read it, to learn how to play, but the curiosity to search. And today with the search engines, it's way, way faster to just go directly retrieve something that you're interested in. Of course, difficult to contextualize it with the other knowledges of it because it's all related. The sociological, the technological, the psychological, and I still think that it's up to me as the teacher to teach them how to play the piece, but also help them to organize their thought or how to think the piece, or then to organize as well their awareness of how come this piece comes into become what it is, from where it comes in terms of its predecessors or where it was inspired by, and how it evolved to be this, formally, aesthetically, because then every detail of your playing as a student will become meaningful because you'll put it into a context, regardless if you miss some details, because there will always be details to be missed because there's so many. But the general idea is to know that when you play on a single piano Haydn sonata forte in dynamic range, and you play it in a Beethoven or a Chopin sonata, it's not the same forte because the texture is not the same, because the meaning of the music is not the same, because the expression of what is a decoration, what is ornamentation, what is a contrasting mood, the Sturm und Drang in German for the storm and lightning, the very quick change of mood between minor and major, loud and soft, which the instrument allowed, but also through which you get this orchestral capacity to hint things that are not played because you don't have the individual instruments, but you do it but with the phrasing and the articulation. So you have to be immersed intellectually in the time period of the piece you play, and then the other time period of the next piece you play, which you practice at the same time. So it's you have to be universally opened, not confuse all for all or all in all, because it's not. It's not just gymnastics of fingers, because after all, yes, you play with the 10 fingers all the pieces. Even Bach, who was pretentiously not playing with the thumb, but that was because of the two keyboards on the harpsichord. But even so, you played, but what does come out of it is the cultivated understanding of the stylistic element in which you involve your playing of the piece. I rather hear somebody make a choice in the tempo, in the phrasing, in the articulation, in the dynamics, in the direction of the line, in the pedaling, in the fingerings that allow or not to hold certain inner voices if you share them between the two hands, because you hear the up and the bottom with the two hands, but the middle voice or voices are shared between the two hands. So intellectually you have to make sure you follow them even if they're organized by two hands, which is intuitively not that natural. And then how do you spread your thinking in so many layers at the same time as organize the verticality of the two hands with the cognitive memory of the practicing exercises and the repetitive going through details of sections in order to be able to deliver them in the given tempo that you're told or you choose or you expect to be. Since the metronome was all invented in 1820, obviously the music before was the meter and the indication, but that was with the room for, let's say, differing between time periods and geographic situations. But of course, since we are not in the time when these pieces were composed and performed, we have to, in a way, it's very difficult, eliminate the awareness that we've heard dissonances from the further time periods. Mademoiselle Boulanger used to say rightfully that the dissonances of yesterday are the consonances of tomorrow. But in these time frames, the short lives of the people composing music in the 17th, 18th century into the 19th, like Chopin and Weber and Schubert and Mozart, who never went beyond the mid-30s, even if it meant not as young as today for the life expectation then because of the development or lack of at the time compared to today of medicine and science. But nevertheless, it allowed for them to open doors towards something that they either do by intuition forward or the next one pick up. And so early Beethoven is Haydn, Mozart, and then late Beethoven becomes Schumann or Brahms, and then so on. So they take something from their past, they develop it or they reject it, or they let's say transform it into what it's meaningful to their personality, even if it's a commonality of the grammatical language of music called the tonal system, with the tension release of the dominant tonic and its delays through the cadences like the deceptive cadence, in order not to finish right away, and so on and so forth. So yes, grammar, technique, organization of thoughts, these are essential. But I believe very much that if they're not grounded in a understanding of the larger picture around the piece from the other genres of the composer's pieces, therefore, not only for the keyboard, but as well as the writings and the thinkings, and how we organize their understanding in the piece, in fact, of life's meaning. It's embedded there. Of course, it's not meant, and it's not it's not a disclaimer that exists in their scores, but you read about the meaning of Schiller's text that Beethoven used in the Ninth Symphony, Brotherhood of Humanity, and how they were trying to transmit a message through the music, either soothing, either expressive, just for the feelings of the passions of the people, as well as their reflection and the way they rethink the things. And I find that the map, like the GPS today, is the organization of the form, in which you install so many different elements which you combine in one way or another, and you follow that evolution of this thematic material. And I think that it's easy today in a globalized world where everybody has the same publication or edition of music, reciting the notes at their best ability with a good technique. It's believable to have some kind of roots, but in fact, for understanding, I mean. But most of the time they don't. And so you can also, decide that it's too much to cover in a piano lesson when the essence is to learn how to play it, not how to think it, how to stage it in its own time period, how to organize your understanding of the subtle evolutions of the style compared to the philosophic understanding of the world, or difference of organization of the societal things for which the instruments also developed, and then how you share music, in which situation, in church, in private, in the rich homes, in the development of instrumental production for more accessibility, and how music became something at home when it was originally in the castle or the church, and then how it's also but more spread. And then you have the recordings and the editions and the capacity now to have it anywhere you go with you, dematerialized. Suffice to know what is which. In terms of the plethora of composers of the so-called classical music, which in fact is way more than classical, in terms of stylistic evolution and time periods and musical language, and therefore the music inevitably of each time period is the exulting expression of the intellectual thinking of the time, fears, hopes, and all these elements happen. And so the Age of Enlightenment corresponds to the sonata form, that corresponds to a certain individualization of the desire to exist on their own, instead of just part of a group serving a group, and or not a group, very few unit of people. But nevertheless, I find that if we don't think that when we teach students the classical music, we need to teach them to understand what it is that they're playing, not only how they play what is recited on the text. The ancient notations were not complete as today. They were not fine, actually, I think marvelous, but unfortunately lost today in the individualized teaching of the know-hows, that you don't combine improvisation in the interpretation. Interpretation is translation. Translation is to be honestly close to the text, or text is the original text with the additions. And so reciting the original text should be enough in terms of the craftsmanship when you reach the capacity to play for a competition and to audition for a school, or to earn a job when you have already your schooling, so that in fact, yes, it's possible to bypass, but at some point or another, the lack of understanding of the context in which the pieces we play were written, in mankind's mindset of the time, and the specific one of the composer who organized it, the notes that we play, because they are organized, even if today we play them all as written and we don't improvise part of them like it used to be the tradition of. It's to do with publication, and also with multiplication of schools in the world for classical music. And so we have highly technically able pianists to play many things that they don't really understand as much, because the teaching is mainly at the playing, not at the hearing or thinking. That will be for theorists and musicologists and people who study to become music scholars. And then separately the composers, and separately the teachers, and separately the music program directors or organizers of festivals or concerts or orchestra seasons, and so on and so forth. So you have at some point the conductors who conduct, the composers who compose, the pianists who play, and in a way, because of the plethora of availability of repertoire, it's considered unthinkable to try to be universally aware of everything that you play and how it came to be, because you'll say, I don't have time to study all this. Unfortunately, though, they do have time to study, but they are always compartmentalized in theory classes, music history classes, music theory classes, and when they play the piano, they don't put it together, because they don't know that this is the case. For the piano, they just take care of the industry of playing the piano, which of course is essential, and I don't deny that. But I think that if the students who study separately this theoretic knowledge, and then they apply it technically in the practical knowledge of their playing on the piano, they have to incorporate their understanding of the grammar of the harmonization, of the capacity of understanding the contrapuntal polyphony of the layered voices, how to organize their thoughts, then how to define the stylistic frame of this composer's, that composer's, time period and evolution of style. All these things daily I do. Of course, what teachers do repeat themselves, and I do repeat already myself here a lot in my statement, but I share with you very spontaneously the importance that I attach to respect the student by giving them the tools to be informed, and therefore they choose what they will develop to keep, or perhaps reject, or perhaps forget from what you give them, because it's not just pouring knowledge, it's also for them to filter it so that it goes through their own psyche, their own culture from where they come, and how they want to study about what is the culture to play a Chopin piece compared to a Bach piece, even if they're pieces of music with fingers playing them, and that there are differences and there are meaningful purposes that have to be reached through the playing, and therefore you give them the tools for themselves to develop their own way of expressing themselves within these boundaries that they will perhaps break on their own creativity when they do their interpretations. It's not just to say that they have to be cloned according to my tradition of knowledge of the piece. I let always myself an open window to their own, let's say, virginal point of view of the score compared to mine that is inevitably from the years already tainted by experience or my own learning. So nothing of what we teach them should be locked in. Even if it's within tradition and within a civilizational situation, time frame in which we say this is what happened that year and that, and so on and so forth. And I think that the heroism in Beethoven, who admired Napoleon before he rejected him after Napoleon, who was sort of the limelights of the French Revolution, which then turned different when he became a despotic figure in turn, and Beethoven erased the dedication of his Third Symphony, the Heroica, after that. This is anecdotic. It's fun to say, but it's not really meaningful how to play. What is more hard to play is how you translate heroism in the evolution of the thinking of the century in which they are writing. How do you develop a concerto, piano, and orchestra, the soloist versus the group, the army of one and the army? How in the beginning it was a complement, and then with the Romantic era, with the Brahmses and the Schumanns, and of course Rachmaninoffs in the late Romantics, early 20th century, and Prokofiev, you have the duality and the battle between the two. The one who can sound on the piano like an orchestra and the orchestra. And so the sense of heroism, one of the group or one versus the group, is very different. And that is to do with the novels and the philosophy of thinking, the mankind's evolution in societies through times, and how the Baroque organization, the early classical, romantic, all these are so important. That's why I could never say how much I insist of the importance to have take the time, the extra time, not to belittle or to take time away from the necessary technique, acquiring technique to sculpt the elements, to learn how to organize the touch, to control the touch in order to develop this capacity of what it's needed by the piece itself in terms of the interpretation, bringing out what to choose to bring out, what is secondary voice, how do we bring it out, nevertheless, how we follow it, how we organize it. It's all about bringing the students to a level where they can make their own choices, and far not necessarily the ones of the teacher or the different teachers they had. Because the students figure out quickly that most teachers don't agree among themselves, because musicians don't agree among themselves. We all have different ways to have reached a certain point of awareness, knowledge, for which we are considered important enough to teach, and not to be irresponsible to teach the wrong things, the wrong fingering, the wrong phrasing, the wrong pedaling according to the harmonic motion, but also the wrong understanding of what is an andante and an adagio between before and after the metronome, and why it matters, and how you organize the beats, and how you organize the subdivision of the beats. In other words, the thinking, the playing, the counting, the melodic lines, the harmonization, the breaths, the silences, and all of these elements together with the ways the composers were writing for opera or for symphony, while writing for quartet, trio, or solo piano. The forms could be alike, the grammar could be common, but the usage of the expression to reach a certain way to express the human psyche's hope, despair, anger, or deceiving, or deception. It's fascinating, isn't it? And I really wake up every morning when I teach with a very great constant energization to bring, by specific points of awareness about the history, the context, and the culture where this piece arrived to be, and how it connects to the literature, the language. Schumann in German, Fauré in French, Debussy even beyond, because they invent, like Schoenberg, their own musical language. But earlier they have communalities, but Chopin, folklore from Poland, and stylized, and then Liszt from Hungary. I mean, yes, it's fascinating, because I think that if I don't teach them the larger picture in order to be very specific about the detail, giving them an improvised version of how this detail could have evolved to that, and how they develop their thought process compared to how they develop differently the thought process later, and what was required, and what was in fact framed by the form, and how some composers broke that frame in order to develop differently their thoughts and to express their humanity. Because in a way, that's what it is. You have rules that you learn to break in order to know why they're there. In the beginning, you have to learn in harmony why not to do parallelism, because you want to develop the mind to think in polyphony with contrary emotions and common tones. So therefore, there is a purpose to those rules in grammar of music, just like in grammar in words or in languages, right? And I find that fascinating because the mind organization of a Schumann with the German literature love that he had for and writings makes his music writing also be the reflection of his thinking. He wanted to organize global group arts and not just art form by art form. The German language's syntax ending by the verb at the end creates a sense of despair or hope or suspense expectation that is comes at a delay resolution of the point of the sentence, if it was in the past, present, or to be in the future. And these harmonizations translate in delayed syncopated harmonizations versus the melody of the bass line. So when you hear that and you read that, you understand that. It doesn't mean that there is always a direct I speak for the music without lyrics, connection between the fact of the syntax of the language of the composer composing the classically trained musical tonal system that was common to so many other styles, but it does in part. And in great part for Russian music that comes to become very prominent in the classical tradition into the mid 19th century, early 19th century. And what happens at that point is that the Russian language tonal accent is on the first syllable of the words, ta 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 ta. And therefore, when they write classically trained music, they write with upbeat beats, not an upbeat to finish with a downbeat from Bach on and even before. Pum 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 pim pum pum. In Russian music is ta-dum, ta-dum, ta-dum. And in German music with the verb at the end, in Russian with the accent on the first syllable, you can find so many parallels, so many meeting points where you can find contradictions or similarities. You can find what you think. You create a capacity for the student to think, to be curious, to study, to learn, to understand. Of course, they're not going to learn Russian to play Rachmaninoff or German to play Bach. I understand that. And I'm not pretending that they will be able to be universally educated or overeducated because time doesn't allow, and then their technique needs to be timely reached because the competitions of pianists, for instance, end in the 30s, early 30s age limit. So in order to play well at a competition, you have to spend your time repetitively practicing and not thinking about the philosophy of the piece. So in my teaching, I try to give them hints for them to develop later in their life as doctoral students or perhaps as own research, and then when they become teachers in turn. But it doesn't come out of nowhere. It has to be a way to organize the creativity as well as to organize the curiosity, as well to give grooves through which they can develop their own understanding of the stylistic way to explore and to make it so that when you play on the same instrument music of a different time period, it doesn't sound just piano being played fast, slow, loud, or soft with all the reductiveness that implements. But it's of course way more subtle in many, many more shades of everything. But still, it is there, and it has to be there. So it is an extra time that I take with pleasure, with joy, with generosity, because I find that if I don't give them that time, they won't perhaps feel ultimately that they're respected. They'll say, oh, he just gave us enough to go by to play the piece, to pass the exam, the jury, and then next school, and then at one point they'll think, so what am I doing? Why am I doing it, and what does it mean? And of course, it's not possible to constantly think while you do, but you have to organize a level of awareness of how you learn, of how you study. So I give them keys to unlock their own locks to understanding this and that, exploring this way or that way. And I think that ultimately it's not that much heavier than just to learn how to play the piece. When you, of course, people learn things in school before they arrive in university, depending of how history, geography, economy is taught in historic perspectives. So not all of them have this awareness of the industrial 19th century development and how the piano as an instrument comes from that industrial development because of the iron frame that was wooden before, and how the tuning changed, and how the sound projection of the piano instrument developed with the steel strings and the cross string technology that allows for resonances that are equalized on all ranges, and then therefore the instruments project more, therefore you can play for bigger concert halls compared to just the organizational systems of playing for the rich patrons. So this is an evolution also in societal, technological, and therefore the way music is, the same music in fact, is displayed and shared and transmitted, and today electronically, and before in mass groups of larger halls, when earlier it was only for the happy few who were the rich enough to afford it. Today you can listen to so much music which is available as in a conserved way, like almost like when you buy canned food. It's like canned music. Whenever in the 18th century you had to be rich enough to afford musicians who come to play it for you at your home, and then you have to create your own library and all your knowledge, like you can do it for astronomy or physics or science. And not everybody was interested in music other than for entertainment or reflection, if it was used for the church rituals of music for the different seasons of human life. So yes, all this can be explained, and you give the taste for that curiosity to the students. And if you feel like some student feels like it's too much to deal with or too much to manage in their brain or their time schedule of classes that anyway already run them very thin, then I don't insist, I don't push, I don't become some kind of dictator of my students' awareness of the piece. But I still think that targeted unlocking of awarenesses, so to say, while teaching essentially how to play it by example or by exactly adapting to their own individual students' hands and morphology and how to develop their capacities of independence and all on their fingers. The technique, the grammar of piano playing, the gymnastics of piano playing, if you want. Yes, all this is then able to be proportionally absorbed if it's taught in ways that is not too heavy on the theoretical side. But since they anyway study theoretically but they don't apply it in their playing, it's lost. They learn it to pass the exam, but they don't learn it to apply it in their trade, in their craft, in their main reason for which they study music when they're pianists, is to express all of this culture, knowledge, and understanding, and curiosity, and organized scholarship of awareness, of knowledge, through their playing. After all, they don't give a conference when they play, they just play. But the way they display, the phrasing, the eloquence, the capacity of being convincing in the discourse, and to be convinced, you have to be convinced in the first place to be convincing in turn, and then how to think, how to learn how to think on your own, all these elements, not because I dictate them to them, because I give them clues for them to blossom it in their own art of interpretation, and therefore feel by themselves fulfilled that they do something to contribute. They're not just reproducing what people played the piece like and will be playing it after them. Because it is inevitably the fact that the score is there and we look at the music, the book is there, and we have to, of course, have more than before recordings to compare to how other people heard it or played it or understood it before others will do. But it's the now of the then. It's no more the future yet. It's not only the past, because there are styles of playing that corresponded to tastes according to the music tastes of the day for interpretation, and not all interpretations are universal. They're beautiful within their own context, but since they became a work over the work when the composers and the pianists separated their roots in the early 20th century, we have the interpretations of a given piece by given people who are more meaningful or more close to the hearts of music lovers, music listeners, or the performers themselves who aspire to become professional musicians. So, yes, you have to navigate through all these things in order to develop your own way of expressing it. It doesn't mean that you have to be original at any price, because after all, there is the tradition and there is the way of doing the grace note this way, the ornament that way, the decoration this way. And then you think, but there are other ways but those few. There are open ways to think about it differently from the upper note, from the real note. And we don't translate it on the piano from the harpsichord. We rethink it on the piano, respectfully from the text of the past, but on the instrument on which we play. And that would be said for the Mozart piece, or Beethoven, or a Schubert, or a Haydn, or a Brahms piece, because the pianos evolved in their time periods as well compared to our piano of today. And so that's why the stylistic frame is so important, in my opinion, when you teach it, in order to give them a sense to think by themselves how to produce this essential thing, which is their own statement within the respect of the piece, which I teach them to respect, but not to recite, in order to narrate it with their own culture from which they extract this sound, this phrasing, this color, this voicing, less this, more that, which, why, how, and evolved, change mind, not always agree that it's set in stone in the way it's supposed to be displayed, because we change ourselves, we evolve in life, we hear more things, we think again, and we think, oh, I should have done this when I did it, when next time I work on it, I'll try that. It's a constant desire to reach the heart of the time period's composer's thoughts, and therefore their time frame, but in our time. So it's not about modernizing the past or denaturating the meaning that it had, by bringing it today with the different ways of displaying it and dispersing it through waves and electronic packets of numbers digitally. Regardless, at some point or another, they have to be fulfilled, those students, to be in turn their own very and profoundly inspirational teachers in turn. Influential, inspirational, dictating, perhaps to a certain extent. These are part of the learning process from which you have to liberate yourself from those ties of the rules when you understand the purpose of the rules. Then you apply them by choice, because you know what they are meant to bring you to express. So you have to analyze the score, you have to analyze the context, and you have to implement in your playing all this simply through the notes, the rests, and the indications of pitches and rhythms and patterns. But if it was only that, it would be just reciting. And that is good, but not enough. And if you customize too much your interpretation, it can become eccentric. But it has to be with a conviction. And I'm very happy when I have students who play with a conviction that is not mine of the very piece's interpretation, but that is valuable, that is constructed, that has roots, that is like an architecture of their own. And because it doesn't hurt to evolve and rethink the status quo, and to be humble enough to put yourself in question every time you open the score, how to really say best this, how to really mean better this, how to organize better, not to be confused by this or sidetracked by that, how to keep my mainline, a line of thoughts. Where is the thread, invisible or visible, between variations on a theme or developmental different ways of the thematic material? It's all part of the Western European way of organizing thoughts and thinking that evolved into a different way after time periods, and it's different in different parts of the world. That's why there are different civilizations who think differently. The purpose of life, the meaning of life, the death as the accomplishment of birth, or the desire to, with science and medication, go beyond the limits of what was, expected as a life expectation in the past, and childbirth, death, and so, of course, in their normal of the day, they produced music that, in fact, is universal and timeless for us to not only cherish, teach, and play and perform, but to carry forward. Which means that there is some kind of universality in the message of these contextual pieces, but you have to first also be immersed in this context in order to retrieve the universality that is embedded in them. Give a meaning and a purpose to what you do besides what it means to you by feeling and intuition, which is essential. But it should not be the only. And if you replace it only by knowledge, you play boring. And if you play only by intuition, you play hectic. And if you play organized and learned, is because you took a score that you trust, that is trusted in the music world, and then you play it because you cannot rethink, you cannot hear what the composer imagined differently to enter at the source of the composer's imagination of the thought and why the composer took this flow, or that flow, that direction, this modulation at this point or not, hint or surprise or exaggeration, and all these things are part of the music language. So we don't pretend, and I personally think it will be very pretentious to pretend that I teach them how the composer composed it. We don't know. We are surprised and we are marveled and we are amazed and we're bedazzled by the way the composers come up with a transition that reaches another theme and comes like a charm that just charms us, like a smile, a gaze. I think so much that this should never be erased, because that's in the first place what attracts people to music is a language of a culture, perhaps a hint of a psychological expression that is common to humanity within different cultures and civilizations, but still, it is something of the human experience, the mankind experience on earth.